So I just want to say a couple words about Dave. I've known Dave and Julie for, seems like I don't know how many years, many years, but they started their business. When did you start the business?
It's like 15 years ago.
Yeah,
So I think 2011.
yeah. And I've watched how they've grown the business and how they go about doing business and building their reputation and all the innovation stuff. And it's just, it's like a great success story, and they've been a sponsor of the Transpac race for a couple of cycles now, which is really appreciated. So yeah, I'm Dave. Take it away. I love rigging and splicing and all that stuff. So I'm dying to hear your presentation. So thank you for being here. Take it away.
All right. Well, yeah, if you guys can all see my screen, kind of going to share some slides behind me. And I think I've got the chat up. So if anybody has any specific questions, feel free to throw them up there and I'll try to answer anything. But I tried to think about how do I organize, something about rigging because it's a pretty wide topic. Everything from your mast and standing rigging to running rigging, hydraulics, winches. I mean, we got a lot to cover. So I decided to kind of go at it from a timeline perspective. So, we're about a year out from next year's Transpac. What should you be thinking about now versus what can you think about later? What should your priorities be? So I'm going to kind of go through this in a sort of a timeline oriented mode, beginning with the stuff that you should be thinking about the soonest. General overview of a timeline. Let's say we're beginning 8 to 12 months before. A lot of people start sooner than that. But I think the first thing you'd want to look at doing is getting a baseline for your boat. So a full rig inspection is generally advised, where you have some professionals go through the boat, and you want to evaluate, what's the age of my standing rigging, how are my systems working, and basically what you're looking for is, are there any major projects that you're going to need to take on that are going to take, quite a bit of time? If you need to re-rig your boat, if your mast is damaged, if you need to replace winches. So to start with a full rig inspection, a winch and hydraulic service. So then, moving forward 3 to 6 months before the race, that's when you want to be looking at finalizing, rope orders. You want to be doing a lot of sailing during that time, right? The boat shouldn't just be sitting at the dock because there's no real way to know if stuff's working or going to break unless you go use it. So doing some coastal races, whether that's, offshore race week or islands race or a PV or, any of these good races that you can really test your systems are going to help you know a lot. A boat that's just been sitting at the dock is going to be prone to having problems. You want to be building spares kits. So thinking about, okay, we've gone through our systems. What are we likely to break? What can we order as spares? A lot of the Hark and Winch systems come from Italy, so they take a little while to get parts. All right, so we'll just move straight into rig inspections because that's probably the biggest thing that a lot of people are going to want to know about is what do you need to do to make sure your rig is safe for going to Hawaii? Uh, so there's different guidelines for different types of standing rigging. So you've got wire rigging, rod rigging, carbon rigging, various other types as well. Those are your main three. Uh, and there's various types of fittings, wedge fittings, mechanical fittings. One thing you want to know is that not all fittings can be completely inspected aloft. So typically wire rigging can be. You can go right up to wire rigging and you can see cracked swedges. So, here's a cracked swedge right here, and you can see visually. This was actually about an 80-foot sailboat that had been re-rigged within the last 5 years by a company, and we climbed aloft and found cracks like this in almost every single shroud. No idea why. Fittings and wires seem to be appropriate. Could not determine the cause, but it was right before a big major ocean crossing. So, good to have external rig inspections. But then you get into like rod rigging, you can't see the cold heads inside of the fittings without disassembling it. So you can do an external rig inspection, but that's only telling you what you can see on the outside. Other damage, you can have, carbon fiber rigging like here. You get external chafing, abrasions where there you can see the carbon fiber core, damage to the threads on turnbuckles. So these are all the kind of things we're going to look for in a rig inspection. Um, if you look up at your mast and it looks bent like that, you might have a problem. Something might be letting go. In that specific picture, it's a carbon shroud that the internal core actually broke and the shroud was getting longer, just sitting at the dock under regular tune. So that was completely compromised.
Wow.
Um, you can also get a lot of corrosion at your spreader tips. So here on the right is a standard tip cup for rod rigging, and that's a big stainless cup that goes into the spreader tip. This spreader tip's carbon fiber. A lot of the time they're aluminum. Either way, you can get a lot of corrosion going on in there, especially when people go aloft and put tape all over it and trap a bunch of moisture in there. And that material is pretty thin because all the load is pushing inward. So the engineers don't give you a whole lot of material on the outside of that. And so just a little bit of corrosion can cause cracks there. And that can get relatively expensive to rebuild spreader tips. So that's the kind of thing you would want to figure out, at least 8 to 12 months before a race if you're going to need to rebuild your spreader ends. Some generic pictures doing some rigging. So a lot of people are unaware of the timelines for standing rigging, and every type of standing rigging is going to have a different timeline on it. And what is a timeline? Well, a timeline is a manufacturer guideline or a regulation or a combination that we as riggers can't really violate. So, for example, if you have wire standing rigging, whether that's 1x19 or die form, the maximum lifespan on that is 15 years. And if I go look at it and I don't see anything visually wrong with it, but it's 18 years old, in my rig inspection, that's going to be condemned. That's past its manufacturer's lifespan. And this comes from statistics that insurance companies have reviewed over when rigs are failing. It also comes with talking to the manufacturers who will cite things like cyclic fatigue, where even if that boat's just sitting at the dock, that piece of rigging is up in the wind, it's vibrating, the metal is work hardening. So you may not even have a physical crack, but you just may have work hardened metal. Rod rigging, same thing. 15 years is the maximum lifespan. And it also has the manufacturer recommendation that every 5 years you need to take your mast out and disassemble that rod rigging in order to properly inspect all the cold heads and stem balls and internal fittings that are inside the rigging components. Those fittings are meant to be able to move and articulate. And after about 5 years, any lubrication in there is usually dried up and they stop being able to move and they can start to get damaged. So, if you haven't pulled your rig in 5 years and you have rod rigging, you're due to pull the rig out, take it all apart, clean it. We can do dye penetrant testing on the ends to check for hidden cracks. And it can be signed off for additional life, up to 15 years, and then it's just due for replacement regardless of what it looks like. If you have carbon fiber rigging, EC6 or CarboLink, you're going to have various timelines based on what the manufacturer says. So oftentimes the normal carbon fiber we see will have a 15-year maximum, maybe even unlimited, but they'll want you to send it in maybe at 5 years or 10 years. Pretty easy to find out because all that stuff will usually have a serial number, and you can do a serial number search with whoever manufactured it and ask, do you have a service history on this? Is this due to be sent in? When you send it in, oftentimes, like if it is the Future Fibers product that goes to Valencia, Spain for service, they actually cut all the braid off of it, inspect all the carbon fiber inside, and will rebraid it. So it's a fairly significant service. They do have some products that have better covers on them that they're going longer before you need that service. So again, it's going to vary a little bit on the exact product. There's other stuff out there. There's aramid or Kevlar rigging. That's usually more just on backstays, not as common on lateral shrouds, but that's usually a 5 to 7 year lifespan. Again, depending on the manufacturer guidelines. PBO is often 3 to 5 years. That's a pretty rare fiber to find these days just because of that short lifespan. People really switched over to carbon fiber instead of PBO. And then there's the annual visual rig inspection aloft, which really you are, according to most insurance companies, supposed to do just an aloft external inspection once a year, looking for any external damage that's easily visible. So, within that 8 to 12 months, you want to be getting a first rig inspection, then checking your age dates, your manufacturer guidelines to determine, do I need new shrouds? Am I going to be okay with what I have? What do I need to do? Basically, you want to plan this out. Other things that you're going to do is hardware inspections. And typically, this would also be done during a rig inspection. Everything on the deck is going to be inspected. Versus, I think in the photo behind me, this would be like a 5-year inspection of a mast where everything's taken apart and more carefully inspected. But you're going to be looking for surface rust, pitting in the hardware, worn or warped equipment, cracks, flat ball bearings, kind of any kind of visual damage is kind of what you're looking for in an inspection. If you see rust, that's not necessarily a problem, but it is an indication that you should look more closely. Something's happening there. Now, it could be surface rust where something got on your fittings and rusted, and it can just be wiped away. Or you could have, something coming from inside the metal where you have actual material loss or a crack. So, rust by itself isn't a problem, but it does draw our eyes in to have a closer look at that area. You can see like here's some Tylaska shackles on the left that are pretty rusty. So, I don't think those ones actually had any cracks in them. They're fine, but they should be cleaned. Some others, corroded, worn components, shivs that'll get flat spots in them if they don't move. The rope will start to burn through them. Basic care for your rigging. How do you make this stuff last longer? Clean everything. Warm, fresh water and soap does wonders. Just getting the salt off of it is huge. We see the most damage in areas where salt has built up. If you like to put electrical tape over things, you probably want to remove it after you're done racing because the electrical tape will trap salt water on your fittings and cause them to corrode. So, when we do a rig inspection, we're pulling tape and we're finding a lot of our damage is under tape. And use
Well, you
proper
can come over and
products to
watch it
protect
here.
from corrosion. Tef Gel, Lanacoat, and Duralac are great to put on threads if you're putting fasteners into things. Tef Gel is a white paste that's a general just anti-corrosive, but it doesn't have a retaining compound. Lanacoat's a similar product.
Okay.
Duralac is also to keep you from having corrosion issues, but it also has a retaining compound. Then you go down to like Loctite and Vibrotite. Those aren't going to have as much of an anti-corrosive, but they are going to have a retaining compound. You can use derusters do wonders. So anything with oxalic acid, so any kind of rust buster, whether that's Tylaska Shine, Wichinox, Ospo, any generic rust buster, it's usually the same active ingredient, which is oxalic acid, which actually just attacks the iron deposits on the surface of stainless steel fittings. So it's not just going to remove the rust, it's actually going to remove the iron that's rusting on the surface and make it less likely to rust in the future. And then other good things to use, McLube One Drop is basically the only thing you should put on composite ball bearings. This is actually fairly important because we see a lot of people still using oil or McLube sail coat spray on composite ball bearings, whether this is your cars on your track systems or shivs. So if you use any kind of an actual lubricant on a composite bearing, it's going to slide and it's going to generate flat spots in that bearing. So the only things you're really supposed to use on that are either warm soapy water, or if you really do want to use a product, the One Drop product from McLube that Harkin sells it's a conditioner, and it basically removes salt and cleans the bearing without putting any kind of a lubrication on it, so that bearing is still going to roll and not slide. So going back to rig inspections, liability. What is your insurance company going to be looking for? They're going to want a recent clean rig inspection. They're going to want to know that your standing rigging's within its age limits, and they're going to want to know that you're complying with manufacturer guidelines. So basically that would mean that if a rigger goes aloft, they're not going to see any major flaws. They're going to see that you're following the appropriate guidelines for a replacement schedule and service schedules on your standing rigging, whatever those may be. And that generally around the boat, when we inspect all these other components, we're not finding cracks or broken things or wear. So that's kind of what you're going to want to get a clean rig inspection. And obviously, a rig inspection can be done right before the race, assuming it's clean. But if you get a rig inspection done right before the race and it turns out your shrouds are 20 years old and you didn't realize it, that's going to be a problem. And you're going to be in a situation where you might not be able to get insurance on your rig. Hydraulic systems, another part of the rigging world, which are a little bit more complicated and a little bit more finicky to deal with. Guidelines for hydraulic system service. You've got a basic system check and test versus a complete system rebuild. A system rebuild is pretty extensive, and that includes taking apart basically every component, every pump, every valve, every cylinder, replacing all the O-rings in those, cleaning them thoroughly, testing them in the shop, reinstalling them, bleeding all the hydraulic lines in the boat, removing the reservoir and cleaning it, putting new oil in the system, replacing the filters, and then basically repriming and testing the entire hydraulic system. So that's a pretty big job. You're supposed to do it every 5 to 7 years. On Grand Prix systems, it can be more often. Some of the, if you bought an old TP52, you may have Super Series level components that are supposed to be rebuilt every year. If your cylinders are made out of titanium and they're running at 7,500 PSI, it's going to be more often. So that's something to look at, and that's something to look at ahead of time, because a lot of times people don't even pay attention to these, and we get called in to do a check, and there's stuff that's pretty heavily damaged and can't be rebuilt. If there's, material loss, the metal's corroded, you may be looking at something new. So again, this is something to have done, a year ahead of time, 8 to 12 months ahead, so that, you can identify if you have any bigger problems. The other thing that is good to get this done ahead of time is just that these systems are really finicky. I would say there's almost a 30% failure rate on brand new hydraulic components that we get from any manufacturer. They can have metal shavings from the factory in them. You can find a little tear in an O-ring. They are just troublesome to troubleshoot. So you don't really want to do a rebuild and then just go right into a race. You want to do a rebuild and then you want to go do some sailing, some sea trials. You want to test these systems and you want to find out, is it all working properly? And you want to have that system working properly without having anybody messing with it, at least 6 months before the race, so that it's tried and tested and proven. And then there is always the question, individual component repair versus an entire system service. So, if it's just my backstay cylinder leaking, can I rebuild that? Yes, you can rebuild just your backstay cylinder. The question would be, why was it leaking? Did something from upstream get in it? Did one of your seals in your hydraulic pump break down and push debris up the line, and that went into your backstay cylinder and caused it to leak? So if your whole system's 7 years old and you've got a component going down, you really probably want to rebuild that entire system all at once, rather than if you do component by component, you can then contaminate your freshly rebuilt component with sludge from the rest of the system. So we usually discourage individual component repair unless the system's been freshly rebuilt and we're in that kind of troubleshooting phase of, okay, it was rebuilt last year and now this is having a little issue. Let's look into that. Maybe there was an anomaly there, because again, they are very finicky. And here you can see some pictures. So on the right here, this is, what the inside of a standard hydraulic cylinder looks like. So you've got a bunch of rubber O-rings that are going to be, holding all your pressure. And so if you get one little metal shaving that gets in there or one little tear in that O-ring, you're going to start to lose pressure. You're going to have a leak. Some leaks are external, where you're getting oil on the outside. Other leaks are internal, where they're leaking from a high pressure side to a low pressure side of a cylinder. You don't actually see it. All you know is that you're having, pressure loss in the system. Kind of went over this, but, here's the timeline. Try to have all the major rebuilds done at least 6 months before your race. Go sailing and thoroughly test these systems. Make sure, because they can be very finicky. Keep spare seal kits for your system to expedite rebuilds when needed. If you've got really basic, components that aren't aren't very rare, you might not need to do this. But if you have, really exotic Grand Prix systems, those seal kits might not always be in stock. So you may want to have those on hand just to expedite a rebuild if you need one in a hurry. There's nothing worse than being, in the final 3 days before Transpac and one of your cylinders starts leaking. And we try to have everything at our rigging booth we can, but if it's an exotic Grand Prix cylinder that's completely custom, if you don't have a seal kit, I might not be able to get one in time. And so especially if you have a really Grand Prix race boat, spare seal kits are great. And then just prior to the race, if you're worried about the system at all, it's never bad to have it tested and inspected again. A quick onboard inspection is just kind of cycling the cylinders, looking through all the lines. A lot of times hydraulic lines are hidden in bilges and stuff, so just checking for leaks, looking for any drips, stuff like that. A lot of times there's vibrations on boats, and fittings can get a little bit loose and just need a little bit of a tighten. So and you can use glow in the dark paint on your hydraulic panel so that it glows at night, which is kind of cool. Winch services, pretty similar to hydraulic services. A year ahead of time, you should probably do a pretty thorough service. So we go by the Harkin Pro Care guidelines, which is it's full service. The winches get, removed from the boat. We don't usually unbolt the bases, but, we'll disassemble the winch on the boat, take it to the shop. Every single part gets deep cleaned. We use ultrasonic parts washers here that really get them spotless. Every part gets inspected for wear, cracks, and then the whole thing's put back together with proper grease in the right places, pawl oil in the right spots. You never want to put grease in your pawls. Those only want to have oil. Usually want to replace all your pawl springs, and then you want to do a detailed service report. So this is a template of the standard service report that Harkin does, where they're going to make notes of any kind of damaged components. And this is really the reason that you want to do this a year before the race, because there can be stuff inside that's not causing the winch to not work yet, but there can be cracked gears or bearings that need to get ordered in. So with, a full service, you should get a full service report. And that's going to identify any, red parts or things that need to be replaced pretty much immediately. It's like catastrophic failure is looming. Yellow parts are things where you're just getting some wear. Maybe the teeth on your gears are wearing down. Probably can keep sailing as is, but recommended to replace at some point. So here on the right, this is a really good example of some teeth wearing down on some gears. So you'll find inside the winches there's stainless gears and there's bronze ones, and the bronze ones are meant to wear down faster than the stainless ones. So when you get fresh parts, that they're flat on the end of those teeth. So if you look in there and the end of those teeth are sharp, that's because that's that much material loss. So it's not an instant need for replacement. It's a wearing down. It's a percentage thing. You will start to get a rougher feeling winch and system if your gears are worn down than if they're fresh. So for performance, you want fresh stuff. They can be expensive, so you kind of got to prioritize. But that's one thing that a full winch inspection is going to show you is your priorities. If you were going to replace everything, how much does that cost? Versus if you just want to go with the really critical components, what does that cost? So again, you want to do that 8 to 12 months before, because sometimes parts need to get custom made. Depends again a bit how exotic your boat is. It's good to create a spares kit for on board. Pawls and springs are the first thing, oil and grease. And then it's a little bit of a question mark. What do you do beyond that? And it really depends on the winch. So we tend to make spreadsheets for each type of winch and go through them and try to identify the most common parts to wear down. If you're running, electric motors on Harkin 65s, it's really likely that you're going to twist your center shafts because it's a direct drive in that motor. If your crew doesn't downshift into second and third gear at the right times, first gear, the motors are often powerful enough to actually start twisting the center shaft in there. So, we know on that specific winch that a center shaft is a good thing to carry. Versus if you have radial winches, there's other components that are more likely to break down. And there's also, just the question of cost and weight. So kind of prioritize a spares kit versus what's easy to carry, what's easy to buy versus what's more exotic. Obviously, if you have a lot of different types of winches on your boat, you're going to need a bigger spares kit versus if you've got a lot of the same kind of winch, you can simplify things a little bit. Here's some more pictures of, winch services. So next one is working with vendors. So let's say you're in this 8 to 12 months out window, and you're gonna order some things. You're gonna, whether you're gonna order a new winch system, hydraulic system, you're gonna make changes to your boat. You want longer spinnaker poles, outriggers, new masts. Any kind of big project that you're ordering. There's different ways to deal with vendors, and it's not always easy. We can do things on our end in a hurry, but we'd like more time. We usually don't like putting masts in a week before race start. So some tips for working with vendors. Be very clear on what needs to be accomplished. Give your vendors a good outline. What are we trying to do here? Don't give them a big fuzzy, gray area where you're undecided and your crew hasn't picked what you're going to do. Okay, we want a new spinnaker pole, but we don't know how long we're gonna want to make it. Well, then nobody can quote that spinnaker pole or build it, right? You're going to have to lock things in. And that may even be talking to your yacht designer and getting them to lock in, what length is our spinnaker pole going to be? We need to make a decision on our rating here. We can't wait forever on this. I like to provide false deadlines because I've learned that a lot of our vendors are not going to move unless they have a deadline. So if you say, I've got a year until this race, well, they're going to use the whole year. And some of the reason it's not always malicious. They're not trying to do that, but they're working with small teams. Everybody's running lean these days. And the manufacturers are also trying to service their entire customer base. So, if your project is noted that it doesn't have a tight deadline and they get an emergency in where they've got another customer who's got a race in 3 weeks, they're going to stop working on your project and they're going to try to help out that other customer because they want to make everybody happy. And so it's only if they have a deadline to work on that they're going to keep your job at the top of their list. And maybe you don't have a deadline, or maybe you want to create a fake one. A lot of the times, planning a coastal race is a really good idea. Something in the spring before Transpac, where you're going to say, we need all of these systems functional before, Islands race so that we can test everything. And that's a hard deadline. And you tell your vendors that and try to not let them slip. And then you just know in your head, look, if they run behind and they miss that deadline, it's not the end of the world, but don't tell them that because if they know that you're going to let them off the hook, they will probably miss it. So the other thing we've found with working with vendors is most of the time is lost at the beginning of the project. So you've got an 8-month window to build new components. You can have your designers and your engineers eat up 4 or 5 months of time accomplishing almost nothing at the beginning because they weren't in a rush. And then they put all of that pressure on the back end of their production team and their assembly team, and then inevitably us at the end when we are trying to fit these to your boat. And all of a sudden, things are getting overnight shipped, things are running behind, and they're like, well, we're working as fast as we can. And it's, well, yeah, but you are now, but 6 months ago, you weren't working at all. So I think trying to really stay on top of the vendors is important. And it really has to come from the owner. It's, a subcontractor, it's hard to push because we're not the ones spending the money and writing the checks. So the owners need to be involved or the boat captain. But really, an owner who pushes is going to get what they want a lot more than an owner who just sits back and hopes that it all comes together. So I wish I could speak nicer of our industry, but again, it's just relating to them trying to solve everybody's emergencies that are always happening. And unfortunately, the person who plans properly usually gets punished because they help the people who didn't plan properly. And then just here's some pictures of some of the vendors we work with, Harkin, Offshore Spars. And, it's important to realize that also these vendors are pretty separated from the actual start of the race. If you're working on new winches at Harkin, that's in Italy. If you're working with Offshore Spars, they're out in Michigan. So they're not here on the front lines. They're not seeing what's going on. So they're only going to know what you're telling them about deadlines and how the project is going. So kind of keeping in touch with them is good to keep them on track and make sure everything's going properly. Then my favorite part, running rigging. This is probably the easiest part. So just have a quick talk about qualities of rope. What and where to use different types of rope. So break it down into two components. You've got your core, which is inside. That's what carries all the load. And you've got your cover. And that's what's outside. That's what you're holding on to. That's what's going on your winch. That's what's going in your clutches. So starting with the core, pretty much everything on a race boat is going to be dynamic core at this point. On cruising boats, there's more polyester core. Polyester is great, but it's not nearly as strong for its size. It absorbs water. It's heavy. So, most race boats aren't going to be using polyester. They're going to go to Dyneema. There's other fibers, Kevlar, Technora, PBO, Vectran. Those are all pretty much out of date and really don't have a place as cores on any of our rope anymore because Dyneema has gotten so good. And the reason for that is those fibers may be strong, maybe low stretch, but they tend to be very unreliable as compared to Dyneema. So in the Dyneema range, you've got various grades, SK78, SK99. Basically, the higher the number, the lower stretch, and the stronger it is. And then you've got max versus standard. So max is any kind of a heat set core where they've actually taken that rope and put it in an annealing oven under load and pre-stretched it. And typically when you do that to a piece of rope that's Dyneema, it's going to go up about 30% in strength and the stretch is going to drop dramatically. And you can find max versions of any of the fibers, max 78, max 99. A max rope is going to be stiffer. So, you're going to get a stiffer rope. It's not going to be as soft. So you want to know that. So we usually don't just go to the highest quality, most expensive rope on every application. We're looking at, what level of performance do you need out of this compared to, how big it is. So, if you've got a Genoa halyard that's not on a halyard lock, and you're going to try to hold all the load of that halyard on the winch, and you've got 60 feet of rope between that winch and the head of that Genoa that's going to be stretching, you may want that to be the highest grade rope. That may be an SK99 max because you want the lowest stretch possible. Versus if you've got a spinnaker sheet that's pulling on a nylon spinnaker, you don't really need a very low stretch rope for that. And it's probably sized to be something comfortable in your hands. So it's probably a lot bigger than it needs to be. You may go all the way down to like an SK75 that's blended with polypropylene to just save money. And that's going to be absolutely appropriate for that application. So, each line, you're just going to try to do the best type of core for the application. And then moving on to covers, it's kind of the same story. So polyester is your cheapest, most basic cover. It's what most rope is made out of. It does absorb water, so it gets heavier, feels great on your hands, comes in a lot of colors. Generally good wear and medium grip. Going above that, Technora is a really common fiber that we will blend into a cover. And I know I said we don't like to use that on cores anymore, but it is great on covers because it's really grippy. So if you're looking at something that you want to have really high holding power, either in a clutch or on a winch, you're going to want to do some sort of a Technora blend. The most common would be like a Tech 50, which is a Technora and polyester blended line. So, if you want jib sheets that you only have to do 3 wraps instead of 5, a Technora poly blend is going to be really grippy on a winch drum and help with that. If you want your tack line to not slip in the jammer, a Technora polyester blend is going to be really good for that. Another fiber that's getting used more and more in covers is Dyneema in small percentages. And if you blend the Dyneema in, that's slippery, but it causes the rope to be quieter when you're easing it. So, if you want some spinnaker sheets or a main sheet that when you ease, you're not hearing a bunch of ramping, which is basically the sound of the rope peeling off the winch that's really loud. If you blend Dyneema into that, it's going to make it a lot quieter. It will make it a little bit more slippery, so it's not going to hold in jammer quite as well. But it is pretty nice. You can do a Technora Dyneema blend for your sheets, and that's going to ease very quietly, and it's also going to be really durable. Um, and then the really Grand Prix boats will go into PBO, and that's super heat resistant. You're going to start with that on runner tails, which are the highest loaded thing. Uh, it's really expensive, so you want to use it pretty sparingly, unless you're like a super maxi. The last part of cover we'll talk about is Dyneema chafe sleeve. And this is usually used on halyard tips. It's used on loops, soft shackles. This loop in the picture here, that's a loop that's got a wound Dyneema core inside Dyneema chafe sleeve. So that's a solid Dyneema cover that's usually made very thin, and it's meant to just go on for protection. So it's not going to be something you want to put on a winch or in a clutch or hold on to, but it's going to be great in any areas where you think you're going to have wear and you want to protect the core from damage. And being slippery helps with that because it slides and doesn't try to grip whatever's trying to chafe it. It just slides over it. So we use a lot of Dyneema chafe sleeve all over the place. And it's a good thing to put in your spares kit too, is extra Dyneema chafe sleeve so that if you do have something breaking down out there, you can repair it. So over here on the left, this would be, a Dyneema core that they're working with. It doesn't have any cover over it. So that's a 12 strand, which is your most common version. Versus over here, you've got some stuff that's got cover on it. These are Dyneema chafe sleeve tips with, I think, integrated dog bone soft attach shackles. And then this is a combination of uncovered and covered high load strops and soft shackles. See one question from John. How often do you need to swap out the eyes on pad eyes? So I'm guessing you're referring to synthetic ones. Uh, it's basically going to be visually what do they look like. So if they're Dyneema chafe sleeve over the top and they look like they're in really good condition, they're probably fine. Dyneema has a really, really long service life. We've taken Dyneema strops off of boats that are 2 years old, where we had load tested one when it was new to get a baseline, and it actually got stronger after 2 years. That's obviously assuming that it hasn't been chafed or damaged. That was a bobstay that was in straight pull, but Dyneema is super resilient. So unless you see wear on a loop or a soft pad eye, it's probably fine. Assuming it's got a nice Dyneema core inside there. Timelines for rope orders. Obviously, we can and have made entire running rigging packages at the Transpac booth a day before people start. That's not usually the best way to go about it. And if you're going to do that, you're going to probably have to sacrifice on things like color selection, exact blend, exact specs. You're going to be stuck with whatever we have on the shelf. So better to keep the last minute orders to a minimum, a line here or there. If you really want to do an entire new rope package or a lot of rope, 8 weeks is a really comfortable time frame to work in. There's a couple ways to build a rope package. One is with rope off the shelf, which we just cut whatever we have here, and that's what you have to pick from, which is quite a lot of options, but not everything. Versus if you have, 8 weeks, you can go through the Marlowe MGP program where they actually custom make the rope to our spec at their factory, which is really cool. We can say, okay, I want a halyard that's 135 feet long with an SK78 max core that's 6.5 millimeter, and I want a 9 millimeter cover over that that's going to start 40 feet back. And that's going to be a triple blend of Dyneema and polyester and Technora. And I want it to be pink and white and black. And you're going to get exactly that piece of rope. And you're actually not even going to pay for the 40 feet of cover that you didn't use. They're only going to charge for the cover that was put on that. So the waste on that product is basically zero. And the option to customize it is, almost infinite, within reason. You can do a lot of choices there. So if you can order 8 weeks ahead of time, you can spend less money to get a nicer product. And you can do custom things too, like hoist markers or glow in the dark tracers or diameter decreases. We don't usually encourage that because we think that it's unnecessary, but that's how you get those Grand Prix level products, is through the MGP program. So extra time, and then last minute stuff last minute, and you're just gonna have to hope that we have what you need on hand. Prepping your spares. We get asked this a lot, and it's going to be different for every boat depending on how you're set up. So I would be looking at what do I think is going to break and how do I fix it? So, like, one thing I really like to carry is an extra spinnaker halyard because usually that's long enough to be anything on the boat. That can be a spinnaker sheet, it can be a main sheet, it can be a runner tail. Weight obviously matters. So you don't want to just build spares of everything and carry a whole pile of stuff. So you really want to be sailing and thinking about this. The more streamlined you can set up your rigging, the more one spare can apply all across the board. Uh, there's spares that you can just plug in, and then there's things to fix things. So, your winches, you're going to want some spares we discussed. Hydraulic spares are usually pretty minimal because there's not a lot you can fix there on the fly. Uh, yeah, it's going to be boat dependent. Um, I will say that the way things are going with more soft attach is helping with the whole spares thing. It's a lot easier to deal with blocks that lash on, where you can use any piece of rope to relash that block versus a block with a D-shackle. You need exactly the right size D-shackle to reattach that block if you have a failure. So the way things are going with soft attach is really making the whole spares game easier. Speaking of soft shackles, there's a few varieties. So let's see. Up here is what we call a Gen 2 soft shackle. This is kind of your traditional classic uncovered soft shackle. It's easy to open, it's easy to close, it's pretty secure. As they get older and crustier, they may not close quite as well. But pretty good and pretty accepted across the industry. Next level would be your Gen 3 soft shackle, and this has a Dyneema chafe sleeve over it. And instead of a berry, it's got just a split here. These ones are actually quite a bit stronger, believe it or not. Splitting the rope rather than doing a berry means that your strands of your core load more evenly. So you're actually going to get a lot more even loading and a lot higher strength. The downside to those ones is they can be fairly hard to open after they've been loaded. So we usually prefer those for things that we consider semi-permanent attachment. So if you're going to put a block on a pad eye and you're going to leave it there, that's a great spot to use that kind of soft shackle. Versus attaching your jib sheets to your sail with those, you can have an angry bowman who's yelling for a marlin spike and doesn't want to open that thing. And then probably the best version of soft shackle does incorporate a little bit of metal is the dog bone soft shackles. So a couple versions of these ones here have a wound core, so there's a high load Dyneema core inside that. They're incredibly strong. They're also quite easy to use. You can see these ones have a Velcro as an additional safety. You don't really need that. You can use them without that. If this eye is built at the right size, they really won't come undone. But the Velcro is kind of nice. A lot of people like that extra safety. Some people just like to put electrical tape around it. There's nothing wrong with that. Those are fairly expensive because they're pretty time consuming to make. They get load tested to get all the core to equalize. So those are a higher end product, but they kind of tick all the boxes. They're light, they're incredibly strong, they're easy to use. So for your highest load applications or your most critical things like putting your jib sheets on your sail, those are a really great option. We do offer a more budget version of that, which is this one over here. It's kind of a bad picture, but we call that a flat rope dog bone soft shackle, and it actually doesn't have a core in it. It's just made out of Dyneema chafe sleeve, and the stitching is sort of integral to the strength of it. So, you use the Dyneema thread when you're making that, and you stitch it a fair amount. They're stronger than you would think. I mean, they're not nearly as strong as one with a wound core, but you're still getting a few thousand pounds out of those things. So we use those a lot on dinghies, on low load applications, maybe for something like staysail sheets, and they're great because they're easy to make, they're quite cheap, and they're very easy to use. Um, Here's like a high load strop in use with I think this has got a wound core inside that soft shackle. So I think that's a jib Cunningham system that goes onto a hydraulic ram. And then you've also just got your standard loops. So this is a wound core inside a Dyneema chafe sleeve, incredibly strong, super versatile. you have to have hardware that is sort of meant to go with that, versus the soft shackles are openable, the loops aren't. And then another thing to consider for your spares kit is protect tape. There's a whole lot of different versions of it, different widths, thicknesses. This can go on the bottom of your boom. This can go on the front of your mast. It's going to try to keep things like your carbon boom from getting chafed by your spinnaker sheets. Um, so another good product to think about for your spares kit. And then yeah, come find us in the village. Get there. We're going to be set up before Transpac with our full rigging shop. I think that picture's from Offshore Race Week up in Santa Barbara, where we're set up there. But we usually try to bring as much as we can, as much as we think that people might need. We can't think of everything, but we do our best, and we try to be on site to help everybody out with their last minute stuff. Um, Last minute rope work, emergency repairs, and we are always, partnered with Harkin and Marlowe and Spinlock, put in money to help sponsor the event with us. So we get a lot of their product. They'll send us stuff beyond what we normally have in inventory to just have on site. They'll usually send reps there. So, it's a pretty good time at the booth to come and say hi, meet those reps, and see what we have. Anybody got any questions?
I've got one.
Yeah.
So it's probably dependent on the rig size and boat size and everything, but if somebody wanted to go and replace their rig because it's more than 15 years old, um, is there like any sort of price range that you could talk about?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it varies a lot. Anywhere from, a big 70-foot race boat getting all carbon rigging might be spending upwards of $100,000 on a shroud package, down to a 30-footer with, a one or two spreader rig with wire shrouds might be as low as $5,000. And you can kind of interpolate in there, typically if you've got a 40-foot race boat, let's say, if you're looking at a rod rigging package, that's probably going to be in the $15,000 to $20,000 range. Versus if you want to do that in carbon fiber, maybe double that price, go to $50,000 for carbon. Again, depends on the boat. Also depends on the type of fittings. If you've got spreaders with discontinuous standing rigging with tip cups, there's a little bit more cost than if it's an older style boat where they run the shrouds all the way down to the deck. There's a little bit more rod or wire there, but there's a lot less fittings, and the fittings are the expensive part. So pretty easy to estimate a new shroud package. So this is where a year before I would be getting a rig inspection done by whatever rigger you like, and I would the first thing is decide if you need a shroud package. But if they say you do, they should be able to quote that pretty much exactly, and the only variable should be how much time it takes to remove the mast and install it. But with proper measurements, a shroud package should be a hard quote item that should be able to get a quote within a few days, I would think.
Okay, thank you. And you guys are down in San Diego, right?
We are, yeah.
Do you guys like come up sometimes to LA to like be able to do a
Yeah,
rig check for a boat up here?
yeah, definitely. We go up there fairly often, and if it's just a simple rig check, and if you're fairly flexible on timing, we can sometimes try to coordinate that with other jobs in the area, so it's not a full day of driving just for you. But yeah, I can definitely do that.
Might send you an email later.
Cool.
Well,
And
I think we're if we don't have more questions, Dave, amazing job as always, and we appreciate you. So yeah, everybody on here, this will turn up on YouTube, so we can go back and look at it, and yeah, make sure you come by and visit SD Boatworks in San Diego if you're down there. They have a great shop right across from the old Fiddlers, if you know where that is, and they'll be up at the Transpac Village next July or late June probably. So, anyways, Dave, thanks so much. Say hi to Julie, and hope you're well. Hope business is good.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Awesome job, Dave. Thank you.
Yeah.
thank you.
We
Thank you very
appreciate
much,
you.
David.